behalf of the Fourth Foundation and the Open Society Foundations, our collaborating partners, the UN Foundation, I see some here present, Center for International Cooperation at New York University. The Foundation is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year, at a time of tremendous change in global governance, including in the UN system. It makes it an appropriate time for us to engage in difficult conversations about the state of international cooperation and issues of peace, development, security, and human rights. Of course, these conversations are new. From as early as 1951, according to our archives, the Foundation invested in supporting the effective functioning of the United Nations as part of our broader commitments to international peace and development. We even supported the building of the Dag Hammarskjöld library for the nation, and we supported key global gatherings such as the Beijing Women's Conference, the first conference that led to the establishment of the United Nations Environmental Program. We did support that as well, including some of the initial research and discussions on the setting up of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Foundation was involved in those deliberations and the drafting of the Convention on the Law of Seas, just to give an example of some of the work that the Foundation has done over the years. This history matters for the present moment. We are at a stage when multilateralism, and specifically the UN, is arguably the leading institution for international cooperation, is struggling. In many ways, and maybe in more recent times, some would say multilateral institutions, including the UN, have not succeeded in ending wars, when resolving conflicts, or in driving development. But we have an option. We can choose to catastrophize this, or we can see this as an urgent mandate for evolution and a demand to modernize our institutions so they can effectively protect human life and restore the primacy of global dignity. In this context, the past, including the stories that you hear today, offers both reminders of other dark moments and some hope. This is undoubtedly, in our view, the moment for us to maintain unwavering commitment and faith that good will prevail in the end. And at the same time, we need to unflinchingly confront the most brutal effects of our current reality. Let me not take up more of your time, and I would like to thank Thant for accepting the invitation to discuss this book with us, and Karen for agreeing to facilitate this discussion. After their conversation, we'll have a question and answer using some roving mics that I think my colleagues will provide. And we'll also have my colleague Kizito, the anchor from the Open Society, giving us his closing reflections. We'll proceed to a reception in the garden and just have time to mingle and interact. Karen, once again, thank you for accepting to facilitate this discussion. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Otto. Thant Myint-U, you spent over a decade at the UN in 3 peacekeeping operations and at headquarters. You also spent over a decade leading reform efforts in Myanmar, and you are the author of 5 books and a senior fellow at the UN Foundation. It's such a delight to be able to have this conversation with you about the book, which is a really good read in case you haven't yet had a chance to look at it. And there's a lot I want to ask you to expand on. And I encourage the audience to formulate your questions as well, which we'll turn to at about 6 p.m. We're meeting in a country at war, a war of choice, and at a time when the Canadian Prime Minister famously reminded us at Davos that there's been a rupture in the global order, the global supposedly rules-based order. But 65 years ago, it could also feel like there was a rupture in the United Nations of the 1960s. What you describe is very fragile, the UN that you describe, with real questions about whether it's going to survive or not. That UN was just over 15 years old. It had a first Secretary General who was a Norwegian male. It had a second Secretary General who was a Swedish male. There were some people who thought that a third Nordic as Secretary General would be a fine thing, too. Instead, we have your grandfather, U Thant, who had been a school teacher in a small backwater town in Burma, as you say, until he was nearly 40. In 1948, he became a senior civil servant in Rangoon. In 1957, Burmese ambassador to the UN. And in 1961, UN Secretary General. The world was changing, and sometimes it feels like Thant was an avatar of that change. Tell us about what was happening inside and outside the UN that sort of sets the stage for his ascent.
Yeah, no, first, thank you very much, Karen, and I'm really grateful to the Ford Foundation with its long history of work with the UN and support for the UN. So thank you very much, Otto, for your kind remarks, and it's great to be here. Karen, with everyone, as Otto said, on this sunny day outside, to be in this auditorium talking about UN history and the future of the UN as well. I think the thing maybe to think about first is that the first UN reform ideas go back to 1946. So even when the UN was just 1 year old, people were saying it was no longer fit for purpose. And the original conception of the UN in 1943, 44, by the Americans, but to some extent by the Soviets and the British as well, was for this very muscular continuation of the wartime alliance, to enforce the peace after World War II, to keep the Germans and the Japanese down forever, and to make sure that there was no new aggressors on the scene. But then came a whole series of different compromises which led to the UN architecture that we have today in the Charter. But with the unfolding of the Cold War, it was really unclear how this was going to work. And in the late 40s and early 50s, the Americans were very dominant in the UN. But still, the Soviets played along, the others played along as well. But then a couple of things happened by the late 1950s. I think the first is that Dag Hammarskjöld, as UN Secretary General, understood that even in the middle of the Cold War, with the big powers at each other's throats in the Security Council as well as outside in Europe, that there was a role for the Secretary General to play as mediator. And this wasn't something that was ordained in the Charter, but he crafted this role out of the historical moment that he was in. But the much more important thing that happened in the late 1950s was decolonization. And maybe decolonization is too passive a word, because when we say decolonization, it seems like it's something that was granted to these countries. Whereas, in fact, these countries fought for their independence, many of them in bloody struggles over many decades, in India, in Africa, and elsewhere. And I think when we sit here in the US or in Europe, the history of the world seems like, the history of the 20th century world, seems like the history of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, post-Cold War. But for most of the world, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and the fight against empire and the transition to a different world. And I think that late 1950s moment when Thant became ambassador to the UN was a moment of great ambition by these countries that had successfully fought against empire. And I think what they understood more than anything else was that if they wanted to have a peaceful world, that had to also be a world without empire. And a world without empire also meant a world in which the global economic system and much else was also transformed. So they saw all these things as interconnected. They understood also in 1961, with the Russians and the Americans on the verge of a nuclear standoff, that they had to intervene to save the day. That if they, in what we now call the global south, left it to the global north, the world would be destroyed. That they had to mobilize these countries with this ambition for a more peaceful world, had to come together, use the UN to make sure that we didn't have World War III. And they wanted one of their own to head the UN. And so when Dag Hammarskjöld was killed, and now we know that he was certainly killed in the plane crash in what was then northern Rhodesia, it was a moment when people thought maybe the UN won't survive for a few more months or even a few more weeks, but then they came to an agreement on this side at that time, and he was just a little more than a decade away from being a school teacher in a small town, and all of a sudden he was acting UN Secretary General at the height of the Cold War, at the beginning of this monumental phase of transition in global politics from the age of empire to the age after.
It was a pivotal moment, and we're going to talk more about that nuclear standoff in a moment. But he also brought, it was really striking from the book, he was so driven and he was visionary as Secretary General. You're right, for example, that Thant felt he had to insert himself into the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in a way that would not exceed his authority and scupper a role in future diplomacy. He was also conscious that his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, had never tried to mediate between the superpowers. So these were uncharted waters, as you say. Thant was quick to propose himself, his personal mediation, in several conflicts, and he also did his homework. He wasn't lumbering out there blindly. I think the other thing that's very striking is the way people reached out to him, not just politicians, which you'll say more about, but John Lennon, Yehudi Menuhin, Arthur Miller, Arnold Toynbee, the Dalai Lama, Frank Sinatra, Jacques Cousteau, the list goes on, Nobel laureates, of people who wanted to be associated with both with Thant personally and with the UN because of the message of peace. And in 1967, a Gallup poll in the US ranked U Thant the sixth most admired man in the world. But he'd been in office for less than 1 year when the Cuban Missile Crisis hit in October 1962. What did he do?
So, I think it's really important, this story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we all know a little bit about it. We learn about it in school and universities. You might have seen it in a movie. You might have seen it in different kind of documentaries and things. But in none of those movies or documentaries do you ever see a Burmese man mediating between the superpowers. And there's a reason for that, and there's a very deep reason for that in terms of why that's been airbrushed out of history. And I think in some ways it's very deliberate. It's not an accidental thing. But the way the story is normally told is that the Soviets put missiles in Cuba. Kennedy is very skillful, he's determined, he's quite tough, and eventually the Russians back down. It's not a story of compromise or mediation. I think what's important to understand in terms of his role was that he had no mandate. There was no General Assembly, there was no time for a General Assembly discussion, there was no time even for a Security Council discussion. And he knew, of course, and everyone knew that the Security Council would be deadlocked on this issue because it involved the two superpowers. So what he did when he first learned on television, together with the whole world, that President Kennedy had instituted a blockade of Cuba, and there were Soviet ships steaming towards the blockade line, and that could lead to a standoff, that he had not days but hours to intervene and find exactly the right way which he could be useful in the de-escalation of the conflict. And he understood it, and I think in the way that Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy also understood, was that this wasn't a military crisis, this was a political crisis, that both men had to find a way to step back from the brink and to prevent escalation and move towards de-escalation. So the question is, how do you use the moral authority of the UN to create those ladders of de-escalation for both sides? And so the day after, so Kennedy gives a speech in the evening on television. It's a big crisis around the world. The next day, he spends the entire day with his base, essentially. So in deep conversation, by telegram, in person, with countries like Ghana, India, Egypt, and others. And when he acted as UN Secretary General, but also as a representative of the non-aligned movement in the countries of Asia and Africa. That gave him the moral authority. So his moral authority was derived from the UN, but also as a representative of these countries that had embraced the UN and wanted to find a different way. So he sends a series of different public and private messages to Kennedy and Khrushchev. It's a complicated story over those days, but essentially both Khrushchev and Kennedy, in their different ways, used him, or used that insertion of the role of the Secretary General to find the space and the time they both needed to make the climb down. Kennedy used him in a different way as well. I've heard all the audio tapes from ExCom, which is Kennedy's group of top advisors that were meeting throughout the day over the weeks of the crisis. And at least on 3 occasions when his advisors were pushing him to invade Cuba immediately, and we now know that if they'd done that, that would almost certainly triggered a world war, Kennedy responds, we have to wait for Thant's diplomacy. So Kennedy also used him to push back against his own people to create that space and time. And very importantly, I think for U Thant, coming from a small country like Burma, he understood that this wasn't just about the 2 superpowers, it was a 3rd small country that was involved as well, and that was Cuba. And so he flies to Cuba, he meets with Fidel Castro, and through 2 days of discussion, wins over Castro's trust. And so when Castro himself also has to begin to find a path towards a peaceful settlement, he refers to U Thant, he uses U Thant as the point of reference. He doesn't respond to Khrushchev, he doesn't respond to Kennedy, certainly, he responds to U Thant. And it's the same with Khrushchev as well, where when he had to kind of pull back from the brink, it was much easier to say yes to a moral appeal from the UN Secretary General for Peace than it was to an American ultimatum. So I think it was crafting that intervention at that time, and then also playing for the time that was necessary, because there was never any final agreement, there was no peace agreement on this, there was never any formal agreement, even on verification, but it was creating the time that diffused the situation and allowed everyone to pull back in their own way.
And he had personal relationships with Kennedy, with Khrushchev, with Castro, which again, read from today's perspective, I found quite remarkable. But I can confirm, having read through the long Wikipedia entry on the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there is not a single reference to U Thant. And I also read through the long Wikipedia entry on the Iran-Pakistan War of 1965, where there's also no reference to U Thant. And these are the 2 crises you can profile in the book as making it remarkable that U Thant is so absent from history. So what was his role in 1965 with India and with Pakistan?
So the India-Pakistan War began over Kashmir. There was fighting in Kashmir. India widened the front. Within a few weeks, by early September, it had become a tremendous war with, I think, almost 1 million men fighting on both sides. The biggest tank battle since World War II. It was a huge war that could bring in the Chinese, that might have brought in other powers, that could have led to a much broader confrontation as well. So Thant decided then that this wasn't something where he was going to appoint a special envoy or even have his deputy Ralph Bunch go, that he had to go himself. And so he flew with Brian Urquhart, who actually I met for the first time in this very building when he was a fellow in residence. Brian Urquhart, who was Thant's aide in the 1960s. So he and Brian, just 2 of them, actually with press aid, flew to Rawalpindi, spent many days with the Pakistani chief, General U Thant, and flew across the confrontation line to Delhi to meet with the Indian Prime Minister, but also others in the Indian government, Bahadur Shastri and others. And the key thing that he was trying to do in those conversations over those many days in both places was to establish that personal relationship with both men. And again, to use the moral authority of the UN, plus that set of relationships that he built up on the spot over those days. Because he couldn't, as UN Secretary General, miraculously end the war. And he couldn't go in and say, stop, and they would stop. He had to identify that right moment when they had both been fighting for a couple of weeks, when they were near a point of exhaustion, where maybe if left their own devices, they would have continued fighting in a war of attrition, or the war would have spread in some other way. The Chinese would have become involved, or others would have become involved. He had to time it for exactly that right moment when the offer of a face-saving ladder towards peace was something that they were willing to accept. So he had to craft his role so that when they were both at least thinking about the possibility of a ceasefire, that everything was in place. And to put the moral authority of the UN again in that situation, in that dynamic, so that that was also there as an option. The UN option was there. And that wasn't simply, again, his relationship with these men, but it was everything that had been built up until that point as well, in terms of the UN's institution, who was supporting him around the world, but also his personal diplomacy.
to the question of airbrushing from history, though, I was reflecting that during the time I was a special representative of the Secretary General, it was understood that if there was an advance in negotiation or mediation, if there was a breakthrough, you would not take UN credit for that, much less me personally. It had to be owned by parties. It was the sagacity of the parties that had brought us here. Because after all, they did need to own it and implement it. And I wonder if there was some of that at work in why U Thant was not out front in claiming credit.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of layers. I mean, one layer is simply that, exactly what you said, that he was keen in some situation not to claim credit. I think that he was this first non-white head of the UN, and so for some, maybe there was an element of racism, there was other things as well that meant that they didn't want to give him the credit, or he just seemed like a character that really didn't fit in with that global diplomatic picture that had existed up until that time. I think a deeper story, though, is his story around Vietnam and around the Middle East. That I think if he had not begun to challenge publicly the Lyndon Johnson White House on Vietnam, and later become someone who was seen as a problem also for Israel in the context of the Middle East after 1967 in particular, he might have been someone to whom more credit was given than otherwise. I think there's that. But I think the deepest sort of reason why he was airbrushed was that he wasn't the only one who was airbrushed. That entire moment of the people who identify themselves in the UN as the Afro-Asian, the people who came from the newly decolonized countries, who transformed the UN in the late 50s and 60s, who made their agenda the agenda of the UN, that doesn't fit in, or didn't fit in the 1990s and after, with the narrative around the liberal international order. And when that narrative around the liberal international order was crafted in the 1990s, but maybe even the 1980s onwards, this moment of how the UN was fundamentally shaped, transformed, shaped, reshaped, and incredibly successful, didn't fit in with that broader picture. So I think it's not just U Thant who disappeared, but that whole period in history of why the UN was set up, how it changed, how it was successful, I think is not part of our imagination of what global history was in the 1920s.
A rewriting of history.
So
And I want to stay on his personality in a moment, because there's a fascinating picture of his personality in the book. Not just his patience and tenacity, which there's ample evidence of, but his occasional abrasiveness as well. He pushes back hard on member states who criticize him. He essentially walks out on the Soviet ambassador over Cuba and threatens to go over his head to Khrushchev if he needs to. He turns down the US Secretary of State who wants him to negotiate with Chauvet over Qatar. President Nkrumah of Ghana criticizes him, and Thant says he takes exception to that. The New York Times called him blunt-spoken and tough acting. My favorite example, at a time when US President Barry Goldwater was calling for low-grade nuclear bombs over communist supply lines in the Vietnamese jungle, Thant said publicly that anybody who proposes the use of atomic weapons is out of his mind. But here he is doing these things at a time of phenomenal racism and discrimination. Many Western politicians just could not accept that a small brown man, and I'm paraphrasing US and British racist disparagements of him at the time, had anything to offer them by way of insight or knowledge. And you note, and I was really taken by this, that U Thant had to manage a special version of himself, keeping up an image that those who had grown up in a white-only world could respect. I think today we might call this code switching. You do what you have to do to work in an environment that isn't your own. Jackie Kennedy, who was another big fan of his, referred to his rare quality of spirit. What was that quality?
I think that he placed an enormous amount of value in that role as UN Secretary General, I think he really realized that he had to be able to take risks, otherwise why have that job? And so I think time and time again, over those 10 years, he was willing to take risks when he had to. But at the same time, he had to manage all of these different relationships with key figures as well, and to be incredibly strategic in building up that political capital and trying to refresh that political capital so that he could stay on good terms with the big powers, as well as push these other agendas and be useful as a mediator as well. I think his Buddhism was important to him. It was something that he didn't talk about very much. He did talk about it to some extent, but not very much. And so I think some of the values, some of his ideas about the world came from that practice of Buddhism as well. But maybe more than anything else, it's that experience of coming from a small state that had been under the humiliation of colonial occupation, coming out of that. And he was interviewed, I think a few months after he retired as UN Secretary General. And they said to him, don't you think the world is a mess? And he said, yes, the world's a mess. You have the war in Vietnam, you have everything that has been happening in terms of the Nigerian civil war, the war over Bangladesh. But he said, when I was a young man in my 20s and 30s, we could never have imagined that within 20, 25 years, Burma would be independent and would be at an equal place at a table in New York, this beautiful building on the East River, with the Americans, with the French and the British, setting up peacekeeping missions, talking about outer space exploration. If we can do that, imagine what we can do in another 25 years. So I think that spirit also came from this basic optimism, that having gone through war and colonialism, despite all the problems of the 1960s, which in some ways were even greater than the problems we have today, that optimism, that ambition from Van Doon, especially later, is something that we have to know.
Let's talk about his risk-taking in the context of the Vietnam War. It's something he pushed all his life to end. And his president then, the US president at the time, was President Johnson, LBJ. You point out diplomatically that LBJ had only a limited interest in international affairs. U Thant himself was a lot less diplomatic and referred to it as juvenile in this regard. In particular, that LBJ said that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, the next target would be Hawaii. Take us through Thant's efforts to prevent escalation of and to end the Vietnam War.
I think if we go back to that year, 1964, he had just mediated, and in those days people still remember, he had mediated a de-escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was working well with the Americans on a whole host of different issues. He had excellent relations with John F. Kennedy. He had good relations in Moscow. So the UN, which looked like it might disappear in 1961, was on an even keel and set to do a lot, not just in mediations, but development as well. And I think he understood instinctively that if the Americans went to war in Vietnam, that would throw everything away. It would be a disaster for the Vietnamese, it would be a disaster for the United States, and it would be a disaster for the UN. And so he said to the Americans, he said to the Johnson administration in early 1964, or the summer of 1964, he said, if you go to war in Vietnam, you will lose. And this is something that Washington could never even come to contemplate, that this poor third world country could defeat them. He said, you will lose. He said, you have nothing to fear from a reunified Vietnam. They have no desire to come under Chinese or Soviet domination. And what you need is the help of the United Nations in finding a face-saving exit from Southeast Asia. And that was so much against the feeling at the time, because people like George Bundy, who here named after George Bundy and Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara, were saying at the time, if we bomb, the Vietnamese will negotiate on our terms. And we have to escalate. We have to bomb Vietnam. And the turning point was 1964. He actually secretly reached out through the Russians to the Vietnamese. And this is one of the great what-ifs of history, because Ho Chi Minh replied positively. It was a secret meeting with the Americans in Rangoon in late 1964. I'm pretty sure, and I've gone through all the archives on different sides, his side, also the American side, that Lyndon Johnson was not told by his own people people who wanted that escalation. And by the time Lyndon Johnson was told, it was too late. The same day that that negative response went to Hanoi, the next day the Americans began probably 4 years of bombing. And then when it didn't happen the way the advisors had predicted, when after a couple of months of bombing, the Vietnamese hadn't caved in, the Americans landed the first batch of Marines at Da Nang in March of 1965. And that was the beginning of the war. And eventually, of course, the Americans and the Vietnamese agreed more or less on what U Thant had wanted them to agree in 64, but after many hundreds of thousands of people had died 8 or 9 years later.
It's a real missed opportunity, as it reads in your book. And he was also losing some of his allies. Obviously, President Kennedy had died. Adlai Stevenson, to whom he was close, died in 1965, and Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup. So there's a feeling that he doesn't have quite the same, maybe, connections and standing anymore. His public rhetoric got him into trouble with the US and with North Vietnam, mainly because I think by about 1967, when it was clear that this wasn't advancing, he talked publicly about his efforts in 1965. One of his aides advised him that maybe his real forte lay in framing the ways in which people thought about the war, in shifting public opinion. Did he shift public opinion about the war? We know public opinion in this country by 1967 was shifting.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, it's hard to quantify exactly what his impact was, but certainly he was one of the leaders of anti-war feeling in the United States on Vietnam. And he not only analyzed the war in a certain way by saying consistently and again, especially from 1966 onwards, that this is not about communism. This is not a war between communists who take over the world and those opposed to it. For the Vietnamese, this is a war of independence. This is part of their anti-colonial struggle. He went in 1967 to a meeting of 3,000 Quakers in South Carolina and compared the war in Vietnam to the American War of Independence, which Lyndon Johnson didn't like, and that was in the headlines of the New York Times. He put forward a very specific proposal on ending the war, which would begin with the unconditional halt of bombing of North Vietnam. And that was echoed by people from Martin Luther King until he was killed, to Robert Kennedy until he was killed, and many others in the mid and late 1960s as well. So I think he was known not only for his analysis of the Vietnam War, but also for a very specific path that he laid out to a potential set of peace negotiations. But you mentioned Nkrumah's overthrow. And I think what's important to remember in the 60s was that this wasn't accidental. There was a deliberate effort to undermine that alternative world that was beginning to take shape. And if you think about Bandung and that vision that the African and Asian leaders had at that time for a world centered on the UN Charter, peace, development, as part of the general reshaping of the world order. Over the 1960s, you saw one by one governments overthrown from Indonesia, Sukarno in the mid-1960s, Nkrumah in the mid-1960s, many other coups, many other bloody interventions that basically undid that possibility of that world. And I think he felt by the late 1960s, the ground moving from underneath him. That coalition of countries that had put him in office were no more. And in a way, by 1971, he was sort of the last man standing from that Bandung generation, literally on the 38th floor, a few hundred yards from here. Everybody else had either been radicalized because they were pushed in a certain direction from Ho Chi Minh to Fidel Castro in Cuba, or they'd been killed, or in the case of Nehru in India, had died. But he was the only one with that sort of moderate third world vision of a possible future at that time. And the Vietnam War was a huge part, I think, of moving in that direction.
There were some very harsh perceptions of the UN in the US. Lawrence Wright has written about how most people in Texas could not abide the United Nations, which stood for one worldism, which was communism. It stood for talk, not action. The Texas legislature passed a bill in 1963 making the display of the UN flag a crime. And he says nearly every car in the city with an impeach or warn bumper sticker boasted its companion, "Gets out of the UN." And I think this great hostility in the heartland is relevant to the blow U Thant was about to suffer over the Middle East. We really see the UN becoming the whipping boy for what happened in the Middle East. You want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, let me say just a word though on what you were saying before, which is that I think at the core of it, at the end of the day, the Americans were the principal architects of the UN. And there was enormous enthusiasm and support for the UN in the United States. I think what was difficult for many people was a world in which the US and the West would have to share power with the third world as it was emerging. And they just, I think people just could not get their heads around comfortable with that post-imperial world. And that is a tension that has run through global politics, but through UN politics, I think ever since. And we're still in that moment of an unfinished kind of transition to a post-imperial system that is really resisted by many, that many don't feel comfortable with in accepting. I think in the Middle East, in '67, he was faced with an incredibly difficult set of decisions in the run-up to the Six-Day War. I think having looked at this in the archives from many different directions, I think there were things that he could have done differently that could possibly, at a stretch, have prevented the Six-Day War. So I think one can fault him on very specific decisions that he didn't make at that time, and perhaps he should. That doesn't mean he was responsible for the war. Israel had decided to go to war by the third week of May. The Johnson administration had green-lighted the Israeli invasion of Egypt by that time. But still, as UN Secretary General, he didn't do what he did with the Cuban Missile Crisis in finding that possible path for maybe that would have been possible. I think the main thing, though, is that after the Israeli, after the war, when Israel was occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Sinai, that he, in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 242, was consistent in pushing for a peace agreement that would include the full Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories. And that put him up against people both in the US, obviously some of the Israeli government as well, but also elsewhere, who felt that he was being too critical of, it's not so much too critical of Israel, but that he was not being sympathetic enough to Israel's position at that time. The inflection point was 1970, when an agreement was finally crafted, which would have included the full Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories, included Arab recognition of Israel, and a robust Security Council mandated peacekeeping force, including Soviet and American troops, that would have protected Israel's borders. And that was rejected in the end by Henry Kissinger and Nixon in the White House, but also by Israel. And I think he felt very much at that time that that was the incredible opportunity that was missed. He became known and seen as someone who was very critical, not of Israel specifically, because there's a very interesting history as you read the book, that he was actually a very close friend of Israel, great leader, but very critical of that specific set of policies by Golda Meir's government at the time, but also by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
Do you think the fallout from that was a significant factor in the prestige of the Secretary General's office starting to decline, or was that more attributable to?
Yeah, I don't think it was a matter of the prestige of the Secretary General starting to decline, because I think, in a way, I think the thing that boosted the prestige of the office and the moral authority of the office was Vietnam. I think even though he hadn't been successful in stopping the war in Vietnam or mediating the end of the war in Vietnam, for the first time you had a UN Secretary General challenge the United States. And I think that, more than anything, kind of fueled the UN's prestige globally, or consolidated its moral authority in many different ways. I think that the UN, the way in which the UN was increasingly sidelined from many of the big global issues of the day by the early 1970s was a very deliberate effort by the Nixon-Kissinger administration to move things in a different direction at that time. And there was a very deliberate, again, undermining of that alternative world in UN that could have come to be at that time. So it wasn't simply a kind of lessening of prestige, it was a deliberate effort to move things in a very different direction.
Nixon hosts a glittering dinner in 1970, at which Thant is, I think, guest of honor, and he doesn't mention any of Thant's great achievements, even as recently as 5 years before that, so it's quite striking. Much as I was dying to ask you about Thant's obsession with astrology and extraterrestrials, which is true, read the book, it's time for us to turn to audience questions. So the floor is open, in blue in the front row. I'll take 3, 4, and then we might have a couple of rounds.
You importantly mentioned, during the discussion about Lyndon Johnson and the escalation of the war in Vietnam. One of Johnson's real confidants was his successor as Senate Majority Leader, Senator Mike Mansfield. Mansfield was a scholar of Asia and had been to China and actually taught at the University of Montana Asian Studies. He was firmly opposed to escalation in Vietnam, and he told that to Johnson. Johnson, of course, did what he wanted to do, but I just wonder, along with Proxmire, along with Fulbright, had U Thant reached out to members of Congress, and these are top people. I mean, Proxmire and Fulbright. Fulbright was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and of course Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. I mean, through them, I suspect he would have had a great avenue to be heard on this topic.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, absolutely. The answer is yes. So he met with many of the leaders on Capitol Hill on a regular basis. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee invited him to come down to Washington. This was I think it was in early 1968 or maybe late 1967, I can't remember, to speak to them. He said it wouldn't be appropriate for the Secretary General to do that. So instead they all came up to New York. So he hosted them at a dinner, so at lunch. They had a couple of hours together. And one of the senators, included Senator Fulbright and many others, and one of the senators, I don't think it was Fulbright, it was somebody else, said to the press afterwards, we had more candor from the U.S. Secretary General than we've had from the Lyndon Johnson administration in the past 4 years. And so he had many allies on Capitol Hill on this issue. And certainly his idea in 1964 that the U.S. shouldn't send combat troops, it shouldn't escalate the war, was something that was shared by others as well at that time.
On the right, my right.
Thank you. Well, thanks for telling that history. We need stories of successful diplomacy now more than ever. People who drop the bombs posture is tough. It's easy to pick up a gun, to convince somebody to put down the gun. That's what's tough, that's what's admirable, that's what's humane. But my question was, the global south and the middle powers in the midst of this reckless war, what kind of leverage do they or could they have?
Do you mean now?
Yes, now.
I think now, the problem is that, that the UN architecture is the same as before. I think what we don't have now in a way that we had, let me back up and say something else, which is that I had the privilege for these past few years of living in the 1960s. I was there, I listened to the music again, I listened to the films, I watched the films and everything else. And then coming back into this world and seeing what's going on and what's happened, especially over the past year and even over the past few weeks, it wasn't as if the world in the 60s was more dangerous. I mean, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of people dead in Nigeria and elsewhere. I mean, there were horrible things that happened in the 60s as well. I think the big difference was two things. One is that the UN was still energized by this coalition of countries that had conviction in the success of the UN. And that included countries from the Online movement in Africa and Asia, but also included countries like Sweden and Ireland that invested an enormous amount in the success of the UN. And we've essentially lost that. I think the other thing that's different and missing is something maybe deeper in a way, which is that I think in the 1960s, people were so much closer to the experience of war and empire. It was a lived experience. And all the men around, unfortunately it was all men at the time, men around the UN Security Council would have personally lived through at least one, if not two, world wars. And that fear of war and that desire to exit from empire, I think was complemented by this great hope as well. I sense in all of these discussions, in addition to the fear and the problems of the time, this sense of hope and ambition that there could be an architecture of global peace that could be successful. And I think we've lost a lot of that as well. So I think when we have a big crisis like the war in the Gulf right now, it's not that the architecture is any different. It's not that systems are different. There could be issues around leadership in different countries or in the UN. But I think at a fundamental level, it's that conviction, that memory has dissipated. And I think going back to the story that I tried to tell from the 60s, I think the big problem is the memory of periods in which mediation was successful has also been kind of scrubbed out of popular memory. So it's a double loss of memory. It's a memory of that lived experience of war and empire, but it's also a deliberate, willful amnesia of cases like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when actually compromise and mediation through the United Nations was successful. So then we come to the situation like we have now. No one even thinks of the UN very much because they don't have that memory of when it was successful.
But I think we do have the hope now that perhaps a silver lining of the current run of disastrous events is that you will get a coalition of middle powers, less powerful powers, wanting to come together again and push back. And certainly that was part of Mark Carney's call at Davos to do this. And the need to stand together against what we see happening at the hands of big powers. Other hands in the back at the middle, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Mesmo from Tanzania. So just one question in relation to the UN of today, in relation to what you were saying, that UN those days was sidelined, or all the UN efforts by the Secretary was sidelined. How do you put the UN of today in terms of their efforts towards all these problems that this global society are facing today, as against the coming up of the superpowers we see today? So how do you put the UN of those days and the UN of today, and what is your, in few words, do you see the UN we have today in future?
I think we have to get the story right. And I think we all think in terms of stories. And when I said the UN was sidelined, that's a partial kind of reading. I mean, there was an attempt by the Nixon White House to sideline the UN from some of the biggest problems of that time. But the UN was still important. And I think in the late 1960s and early 1970s, one thing that the UN did that was incredibly important was to push forward on this agenda of decolonization by standing together with liberation movements in Southern Africa against apartheid in South Africa, against the opposition of Washington as well as European capitals. And this is linked to something else, because you had mentioned Mark Carney and the liberal international order. And there's this sense today that the liberal international order is fraying, there's a rupture, there's all these problems. But again, we have to get our story straight. And the liberal international order, I think, is a good way of describing the international order that emerged from the late 80s, 90s onwards because of the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War and an American-dominated world system, which had good aspects, bad aspects. It's a very specific thing. I think that's very different from the world order that was created in 1945 by the UN, which is not the liberal international order. It was an international order that was based on a basic set of ideas about a world without peace, a world without war, and which the countries of Africa and Asia then explained or interpreted as having to mean then a world without empire. that idea of a world and that empire, they said, also required the transformation of the global economic system. And into the 1970s, with the new international economic order and many other conversations, the UN became the site of these debates and discussions about how the global economy could be transformed. But all of this was pushed back by the late 1970s and 1980s. And I think a big problem with the UN is that when the UN was remade in the 1980s, within that liberal international order to some extent, it became something very different. It became a place for Western countries especially to deal with the third world of the global south through peacekeeping operations, through donor-funded projects in the rest of the world. And some of that was good, some of that was very successful, some of that was much less successful and wound up in failure. But what it did politically was, I think, in the West, the UN was no longer linked to their core security concerns. It wasn't the collective security mechanism that could de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis. It became something else about places very far away. And I think for the countries in the global south, it became something else, which was a place where their struggles of the 50s, 60s, and 70s to lead and transform the world had failed. And I think a lot of their interventions at the UN became much more performative as a result. And I think going forward, again, I go back to the story. I don't know what the answers are, but I think we have to recover that lost memory of all of these different eras and episodes in UN history and really face up to what the UN really was, the good and the bad. And then we'll have a much better imagination for thinking about the future. I think without recovering that history, we have a very, very narrow imagination in terms of thinking about what the UN can do going forward.
It was a vehicle for all these hopes, and now as we're going into another big UN reform at gunpoint, as I think of it, where things are going to really slim down, I think it's important to remember how fragile the UN was in the 60s. It had a deficit of $100 million, which is $1 billion today. It had major governments fomenting coups all over the world, undermining the Secretary General, a handful of staff working on political matters. I think what became the Department of Political Affairs had about 12 officers in the 60s. This was this tiny thing, and no wonder they were constantly in doubt about whether it would live another day, because it was almost shoestring in so many ways.
But I think the lesson of that, in a way, is that the structures that we have at the UN are the ones that people thought might have worked in 1944, before even World War II ended, and they've never been fit for purpose, to use a modern expression. What is important has never been the institutions. What has been important is the leadership and the people. And I think in different decades, the ability of people, I don't just mean the Secretary General or the people around the Secretary General, but the representatives, the diplomats in New York, others, that the ones who've been able to understand the historical moment they're in, look for ways in which the UN at that particular moment, in that particular decade, can play maybe a completely different role than it had in the past. I think that is what's fueled these different episodes of UN success, which have been different, very different in different eras.
I think that's right. We saw in Cuba and in the India-Pakistan war, when the governments wanted the UN to be effective, it was. And we saw that in the 1990s as well. For those of us who remember what the UN was like in the 90s, governments deciding that they wanted to move forward with major projects made it happen. So we know that it can happen. Further questions? We have time for a few more here in front. Mike, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to focus on your what you were talking about, decolonization and rise of the South, because I worked at the UN from the 70s, to the 2000s, and mostly in technical fields. The UN did a lot in technical fields, and a lot of it was to support developing countries coming into the new world and development and access to water and access to healthcare and so on. A lot of what the UN was doing during those years was related to development, and not just peacekeeping or just building.
mean, all I would say is that, I mean, that's true. And from the 1950s onwards, we programs that were very somewhat more successful than others. But I would just remind us that there was a greater ambition. In the 1960s, the idea wasn't just that the developing world, the third world, would receive technical assistance, and that would be very important, especially in very specific countries. But again, that the UN would be this place where there would be this fundamental renegotiation between the colonial, ex-colonial world and the former colonial powers. And that it was an issue of justice, of rebalancing, of remaking the system. And UNCTAD in 1964, the conference, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, I mean, their vision was of a new global trading system. They wanted to see technology transfer from north to south, we call it that at the time, from the north to the south. But even more, they wanted to see ways in which there would be a rebalancing, repricing of commodities that would fuel rapid industrialization. Because for them, the idea was that we don't want to be permanent aid recipients. Aid is not even that important. The most important thing is we are independent, and that means catching up with the rest of the world as possible. And for many of you, see this in all of the UN discussions in the late 50s and early 60s, where people said, you cannot just be independent on your own. You have to be independent within a global system where you have sovereign equality. And sovereign equality means economic sovereignty as well. And economic sovereignty means that British and French companies are not running your economy, are running your mind. We're not taking all the profits unfairly. We're not talking about all these global issues from a fundamental position of imbalance. But sovereignty means a much more equitable world, and how do we use the UN to move towards that? And they connected sovereignty with peace, and they connected sovereignty with creating that more equitable world. And it's that fundamental relationship, whatever we think about it, whether it's true or not, that was their ambition, and that was the exact ambition that was deliberately undermined over the 70s, especially by some of us.
I remember that being huge still in the 70s, and Donald Prebish, I think was the first head of UNCTAD, was a hero with these views. And we've lost that moment, but I think one takeaway is that the character, the vision, the ambition, the optimism, the personality of the next Secretary General is going to be very important to where the UN can go in the next several years. It's my pleasure to thank you again, and to hand over now to Kizito Bienka of OSF. Kizito.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So on behalf of the Open Society Foundations, Ford Foundation, and our collaborating partners, the UN Foundation and Center for International Cooperation at New York University, thank you for joining us for this thoughtful and deeply resonant conversation. And above all, thank you, Thant, for the gift of Peacemaker, a great work that challenges us to reorient toward possibility at a moment when the world feels dangerously adrift. I think it deserves another round of applause. So, listening to today's discussion, one is reminded that history does not move in straight lines, but it has great lessons for our time now as well as the future. Three important takeaways that we've shared in this discussion. Standing from the age of empire to after empire. So as a peaceful world is a world without empire, that fear of war and that desire to exit from peace really took by the time that U Thant took forward his courageous actions. The second is how one can best use the moral authority of the United Nations to create ladders of de-escalation on both sides of the conflict, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to his role with the India-Pakistan ceasefire. That is very important mediation and sorely needed now. The third was that rare quality of spirit that described that U Thant had. Integrity, keeping a cool head, political courage, risk-taking, strategic acumen, and importantly, optimism, forged from colonialism and that time in spirit of Bandung. That insight could not be more urgent. Many of you get to ask, is meaningful cooperation still possible? At the Open Society Foundations, we believe that is the case, but of course not in its current form. Across our peace and democracy, economic justice, and human rights work, we see the outlines of new multilateralism emerging. One that is more inclusive, more democratic, more grounded in local realities, and more reflective of the aspirations of the global South. A multilateralism that's not only shaped in the halls of Geneva and New York, but in middle power capitals, regional institutions, civil society networks, and the lived experiences of communities who bear that brunt of conflict and exclusion. It's a multilateralism that mirrors very much the lessons of Peacemaker. That durable peace requires confronting root causes, not applying quick fixes, that national sovereignty and global responsibility must reinforce, not undermine one another, and that voices closest to the pain must be central to the process of repair. Today's discussion has reminded us that while international institutions may falter, the human capacity to reimagine them does not. This is where our work, your work, matters most. As the old order unravels, we have a rare opportunity to shape what comes next. A multilateralism capable of addressing structural inequality, restraining violence, protecting rights, and rebuilding trust at a global scale. That task is immense, but as Thant's wonderful book on his amazing grandfather shows us so powerfully, history turns when people choose courage over despair, clarity over denial, and collective action over fatalism. So thank you, Thant, for equipping us with a narrative and a compass at a moment when both are sorely needed. Thank you, Karen, for your leadership and the compelling insight you've kindly provided for this conversation. And many thanks to Otosaki and the Ford Foundation for your commitment in shaping a better future for international cooperation and generously hosting this event. And thank you to all of you here today, partners, scholars, advocates, and friends, for your commitment to this long and often difficult work of building a more just and peaceful world. So I won't get in the way of what's next with the reception, and I'll just kind of comment to mention that as you exit, there'll be books as you exit, so please make sure to connect on that, and the reception will be held in the garden. Thank you all for coming today.